Welcome to OverKing. This is going to be another guide on how to play hybrid maps in Overwatch. What is a hybrid map? Well, a hybrid map is actually a game mode / map that includes both the main game modes for Overwatch, which is point capture as well as payload. Currently in the two maps that we have access to, it's always the capture point first, which then activates the payload portion of the map. However, that could change in the future. Could be inverse. Maybe you have to push a payload and then you gain access to the final capture points. However, it's my opinion that this is actually a bit more balanced the way that it is now, that it takes the attackers to take a capture point in order to then push a payload. But here are the technicalities, guys, okay? So attackers must capture point A first. This is always the first thing at the moment. And then you escort the released payload. It's actually really important that the payload must be released. It's not instantaneous. There is a little bit of a buffer time that allows defenders to respawn and then get into position for the next phase, which I think is actually very important. The match starts with 5 minutes as usual. Now, if point A is captured though, an additional 3 minutes is added to the time limit versus the 5 in normal capture points. Now, escorting the payload to the midpoint / checkpoint will grant another 3 minutes. And of course, the defenders from there need to stop the payload from reaching point B. So already, even though it just seems like it's a combination of two game modes, there's actually some very small differences, but the number of those small differences actually makes the game mode significantly different. For instance, because there are simply two objectives versus one, you now have different strategies with different characters that have more impact traveling through the map. Hanzo might be a clear pick to actually counter the Bastion that's going to sit at point A. However, you might want to actually switch to Widowmaker in order to dampen the defenses for point B, which will be a little bit less static because you are using payload then. Winston's really great at jumping on capture points, throwing down a shield, and then holding the fort. However, Reinhardt is significantly better at moving with the payload and defending his team. So in any one round, we're actually getting a larger roster of characters, probably, most likely, going to be showing up to the fight. Now, it's also really important to know the order of these objectives, and currently it is in a set order. You have capture point A and then payload to B. It's harder for defenders to actually defend their very first capture points because a lot of the times you want to aggress onto the enemy spawn, which is significantly easier with payload because the payload, the objective, is right beside their spawn. So you can keep an eye on the objective as well as racking up some kills, installing the enemy team all in one go. The very first capture point is a little bit different because you cannot focus on the enemy spawn and the capture point at the same time because they are not in the same location whatsoever. So it's very easy to get flanked, to split up your manpower, and overall it's just easier for the attackers to actually go get momentum with having a capture point as the first objective. Not only that, but payload is actually sort of balanced in the fact that it's very hard to get started. But since they actually have their payload as second, halfway through the game, it makes it really easy to gain momentum with the payload. And once you have momentum with the payload, it is essentially like a moving shield, and it's much easier to kind of walk through bunkers, or at least get your bearing on a new scenario whenever you walk through a different checkpoint, because you do have a walking fucking shield that can block almost anything. But you do have to watch out for AoE explosions, of course. But still, it's easier to close a game with payload, and it's easier to start a game as attackers with capture points. So, hybrid maps are overall more focused on having attackers have an easier time. This, of course, can be skewed and, well, rebalanced in the fact that maybe you're going to have more defensive, more zoning type characters on the defending team. So we might have to see how the meta turns out, and maybe this is where a lot of the complaints of Bastion is OP is coming from, because maybe the game is actually being balanced around hybrid maps for its competitiveness. But do know, in competitive, and probably ranked as well, whatever they call that, league, matches work in rounds. So one round, there's attackers, the other round, you switch, you become defenders. Whoever gets to the objectives or further through their individual round is the winner. So just keep in mind, while it does seem like it's just basically those two game modes mixed together, how that actually affects the meta of changing characters and when to do it and how they counter each other is actually pretty huge, and it can play entirely different. But that's all we have to say here at OverKing for this particular game mode. If you guys want to see more technical tips and tricks and guides for different characters and maps, please go to overking.com, and also like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Got tons of awesome content coming out, rolling out for you. Remember to keep the hype alive, and we'll see you again next time.